Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. We have an amazing guest for our endurance athletes who struggle with hydration issues. We have Dr. Allen with us, who currently works in the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food at Monash, where he completed his PhD, focusing on dietary sodium intake practices, specifically of endurance athletes, and the implications for health and performance during exercise. Since then, he's continued to work in defining the sodium requirements of endurance and ultra-endurance athletes for before, during, and after exercise use. And in 2021, he was awarded the Fellowship of Sports Dietitians Australia for his combined research and education contributions to the profession. So thank you, Alan, so much for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited for this episode, I have to say. We reached out to Alan just for our listeners after we attended a webinar that was hosted, and I think this information is very applicable to our listeners. So I'm so excited that we get to have you on here. But before the guests get to learn too much about you, we're going to start with our 2 truths and a lie. So I'll let you break those down for us.
Yeah, sure. So all 3 are sporting themed.
Okay.
So the first one, if we do them sort of in chronological order. So the first one was when I was 11 years old, and near where I live, there was a golf driving range and there was a mini golf course there. And there was a mini golf tournament happening for kids. And basically, to qualify for this tournament, you had to get a certain score. And if you got that score, you got in. So my next door neighbor and I, he was a couple of years older than me, we went down there, played a game of mini golf. He did pretty well. I did not so well. So we just sort of altered the scorecard a little bit so we'd both qualify for the event.
Oh my gosh.
So we both did, but I probably shouldn't have. And then I went on and won my age group in the event.
Oh my goodness.
So I cheated my way in and then won it.
Oh, that's impressive. One. Okay.
Yeah. The second one skipped forward a lot of years to when I was doing a lot of mountain biking in 2009, which is when I got married. About 3 weeks before my wedding, I went out and did some mountain biking with a friend of mine, and you can probably guess where this is going. Went over a whole bunch of jumps, no problem. Got to this tiny little one and just went way too fast. Went over the front, broke my collarbone, and then I was in a sling for my wedding.
Oh no! Okay.
So yeah, that was interesting.
Okay.
You can kind of with one side, you can kind of hide it in the photos a little bit, but there is a couple of photos where you can see it, and my wife's never let me forget it ever since.
Okay.
And then the final one was a couple of years after that, also a mountain biking one. I was doing some work with a triathlon group at the time, and they had a training camp. There was a half Ironman event in a town called Shepparton, which is about 2.5 hours north of Melbourne, where I live.
Okay.
And they were wanting to do some sort of hydration testing and have a bit of a talk and that kind of thing as part of this training camp. So they wanted this at like 7:30 in the morning. So I had to get up at about, 4:30 in the morning or something like that, drive 2.5 hours north to Shepparton, get there at about 7:15, do this talk for them, do this testing, did all of that. But after I'd arranged that, friends of mine wanted to enter this 12-hour mountain bike race, which was in a town called Anglesey, which is down, if anyone knows Australia, sort of the Great Ocean Road, where the Cadell Evans Great Ocean Road race is held, sort of down that end of the world. And that's sort of southwest of Melbourne by probably a couple of hours. So anyway, so I got up at 4:30, drove to Shepparton 2.5 hours, did this talk and this testing for about, 45 minutes or something, got back in the car with my bike, drove about another 3 hours down to Anglesey.
Oh my goodness.
Unpacked my bike about half an hour before the race was starting, had a couple of things to eat in the car, rode a 12-hour mountain bike race. So it ran from, I think it was 11 to 11. So 11 a.m. to 11 p.m., finished sort of 11 p.m. And I didn't have any accommodation there. So then I had to drive home to Melbourne, got home at about 2 in the morning. So it was an almost 24-hour round trip with a 12-hour mountain bike race thrown in.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, before I even guess, I'm going to say you just gave us the best to date, 2 truths and a lie. So you win the medal for that, for sure. I'm going to go with, all of those sounded very truthful to me, interestingly enough. So I'm going to say maybe you didn't break your collarbone. Maybe your friend did. I'll just guess that. What do you think, Nia?
Yeah, I totally agree. These all sounded very truthful with the amount of detail that was in them. I might also go off like a small detail. So I might say the first one with the mini golf tournament. It might have
Right.
been a different sport for kids.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, don't tell us. We
Yeah.
will reveal it at the end, which one was a lie, and whether or not Alan did the mountain bike race, whether he did break his collarbone, or did he win a mini golf tournament potentially. So let's kind of dive back a ways, Alan. How did you get into this field of looking at endurance athletes, sodium requirements, all that stuff? What kind of inspired you to go there?
Yeah, well, I was working as a sports dietitian. I've been a sports dietitian since 2005,
Okay.
and was working in that area for quite a while, working with a lot of endurance and ultra endurance athletes. I mean, that wasn't my personal sporting background. I sort of got into mountain biking kind of a little bit after that. But I was doing a lot of work. I think it was about 2011 off the top of my head when Ironman started running a race in Melbourne.
Oh, cool.
And there've
Okay.
been rumors of it for years. At that time, there was only 2 Ironman races in Australia, and this was the third. And being a hometown race, all of a sudden there was all these triathletes that had never really done Ironman distance. You know, you get a few every year that would travel interstate for races, but very few. And all of a sudden there's this explosion of people wanting to do Ironman because there's a hometown race. And so that year and the year after that, I just the race was in March, and I just spent like pretty much from New Year's Day through to March just writing race plans for athletes constantly.
Wow.
And you know, when you write that many race plans, you start to think about, you know, what goes into them, that carbohydrate side of things, the fluid side of things. And I had this little spreadsheet set up where I could put in, you know, like 2 of this gel and this many cups of this drink or whatever it was, and it would add all those things together from a planning perspective. And that was all well and good. And I put in, because I had the information, I put in the sodium content of all of those products as well. And so it was calculating the sodium content, but I wasn't really doing anything with it. I wasn't really considering, you know, how much sodium they should potentially have. But you know, sometimes athletes would ask me, and I'd say, well, you know, they'd say, how much sodium should I have? And I'd say, well, to be honest, we don't really know. There's no guidelines. And even, you know, if we think about the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, 2016, even if you go there and look up sodium, it's pretty vague what's written in there. There's no sort of quantifiable amount that you can go off from those guidelines, unlike, say, carbohydrate or fluid, where we can be, you know, fairly specific. So that was kind of, I guess, the first thing that kind of piqued my curiosity in sodium was it's one of those things that people just commonly assume we should all have, but there's literally no guidelines out there to tell us how much we should have.
Right.
So that was kind of the first part. And then it was around that time, Tim Noakes had published his book Waterlogged, which obviously very controversial, and Tim's a controversial character, but he came down to Australia to present at the Sports Medicine Australia conference and talking about that. And I remember him just talking about sodium, and he just had this offhand comment like, oh, and of course, people that have high sweat sodium losses are just people who eat too much sodium. So all they need to do is lower the sodium in their day-to-day diet, and they won't sweat so much sodium out. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. And so I sort of went up and had a chat to him afterwards and sort of followed up some of the references. And the references he had was, you know, going back to World War II, most of them, so the 40s and some that sort of followed on from that in the 50s. And so when a few years later, I was working a clinical job as well in a hospital, and then went to leave that job for various reasons. Opportunity came up to do a PhD at Monash, and it was an unusual one because normally a PhD is attached to a project that's already funded and ready to go, and so you're coming on to the project. But in this case, it was quite the opposite. They needed someone to help with the teaching and offered up a PhD as kind of a sweetener, if you like. So I took that, but it was pretty much open-ended, like, what do you want to do for your PhD? So I just thought, well, I had this lingering sodium question for the last few years. Let's look at that. And that's sort of how it all started. And then it sort of just continued on from there as I got sort of more and more involved with it. And really, there's not really many other people that are. So I thought, well, you know, why not just continue in it? Because it's a big area with lots of unanswered questions. Let's try and answer some of them.
Yes. Okay. Well, we have tons of questions for you today that are, I'll say some of them have probably come straight from athletes, or repeatedly from athletes. I think that we get when people potentially come to us, but, I love that story. I think when you have that, you haven't seen it out there, right, in the research. And like you're saying, there wasn't any specific range. when you started to do some of your research, and I kind of preface this, and I want you to answer it, but from what you found, it seems like people can have a varying degree of fluid loss, right, between individuals, and it's not necessarily sex specific either, correct?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I guess if we start on the fluid loss side of things, and for a long time, people talked about in the sort of the sports science, sports nutrition area, everyone has very different sweat rates, and you need to go out and measure to, quantify what that is. And there was a lot of talk that variance between people was kind of just genetic, which for me is we don't know how to explain it, so we'll just call it genetics and be done with it kind of thing. If you look at the thermal physiology literature, so those sort of physiologists that specialize in kind of thermoregulation, what you see is that there is most of that variance is quite easily explainable. But it's just that the sports science side and the thermal physiology side haven't really met in the middle that much historically. But basically, obviously, when we exercise, we generate body heat and our body temperature goes up, and our sweat rate is basically the amount of sweat that's required to evaporate to lose enough heat to maintain what we call heat balance, to basically keep our body temperature within sort of a safe range. So, not surprisingly, the more your body temperature goes up, the higher your sweat rate goes. And there's probably a maximum rate of sweating as well, and that probably does vary between people. But for particularly the ultra endurance sports, you're probably sitting well below that maximum level most of the time, just like we sit well below our max heart rate or our VO2 max most of the time as well. And that max rate is trainable as well. So with heat acclimation, we know, if you're exposed to hot environments a lot, your sweat rate goes up. Well, your sweat rate doesn't go up if you're just riding at 150 watts or something. It'll be the same. But if you ramp up the intensity, you can ramp up your sweat rate a lot more in response to that.
And so kind of in terms of ranges, could you give us, and you could give it in metric or whatever you're most familiar with, but what would kind of be the low end that you've seen in an athlete and the high end in terms of like loss per hour from a fluid perspective?
Yeah, well, there's some normative data that's been published by the Gatorade Sports Science Institute where they've taken data from, I think, over 1,500 tests or so, and they've updated it a couple of times over the last decade. And, most people would sit in the range of probably 500 mils to maybe 1,500 mils an hour is kind of where most people would sit. You do see exceptional circumstances where it might be significantly higher than that. Very hot environments, very high intensity exercise. Obviously, you need more sweat. Or sports where you're wearing a lot of protective gear that prevents the evaporation of sweat from the body. So the body's response is, well, if this amount of evaporation that I'm getting isn't enough, I'll just produce more sweat if I can. And so the highest rates we tend to see is like in American football in summer practice, because they're wearing all the protective gear, big guys generating a lot of body heat, and it's not able to, be dissipated from the body or evaporate off from the skin surface because a lot of it's covered up.
That's very interesting.
But for most endurance athletes, if the higher intensity stuff, maybe the half marathon or the elite marathon guys, you might be talking up to maybe 2 liters an hour, maybe a little bit more. But for the majority of sort of recreational athletes or the ultra endurance stuff, you're probably talking more sort of 0.5 liter to 1.5 liters an hour. But also bearing in mind that in some of those ultra endurance sports, you're going potentially at nighttime, like overnight. In some of the ultra trail races and 24-hour mountain biking and that kind of thing. And so your sweat rates could actually drop even lower than that in those very cool conditions overnight.
That's going to lead to one of our questions down the road. But it also just made me think of something when you were talking about the gear for football players and having to increase fluid losses to cool. Have you ever looked at or done any research out of curiosity in firefighters with their gear and having to enter obviously a building that's on fire?
I haven't personally. I know there are others that have. It's an interesting one, and it sort of fits also. I mean, the other factor that affects the ability to evaporate sweat from the skin surface is the humidity in the air. So in a very humid environment, because basically the ability to evaporate sweat is the difference in humidity between the air and at the skin surface. And the bigger the difference is, the more evaporation you get. So in very dry conditions, you can evaporate sweat very readily. But in a very humid environment, things like Kona, for example, or you go to places like Southeast Asia where they do, there's Ironman races in, Indonesia and places like that where it's very humid, then that's a real problem because you produce all this sweat, but it doesn't evaporate off the body. And if it doesn't evaporate, it doesn't actually cool you down.
So in a situation like that, where there's a high humidity, would that induce someone to sweat more because the body's sensing that it's not cooling itself?
Yeah, it generally does, but it's not that effective at cooling you down is the problem.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Because if the sweat drips off your body without being evaporated, it's actually not cooling you.
Right. Okay. I think that's definitely something I want to dive into too. I mean, have you, with talking about that high humidity, your body does induce a bit more sweating because it's trying to cool itself. So possibly a higher rate of fluid loss per hour, we'll say. Are there any tricks or tips that you would have for an athlete in that situation to attempt to cool themselves? Like, would it be pouring cooler water on their hands if they can access it? Or is there anything that can be done in a racing situation like that, where, again, Kona situation as an example, I guess, would be a good one.
Yeah, it's tricky. So I guess in that sort of, in a dry heat environment, then the focus is on really trying to increase that evaporative loss. And some of that can be pouring water over yourself, because any fluid evaporating off your skin surface will cool you down. It doesn't matter where that fluid came from in the first place. So if it's water that's come from the ocean because you've just got out of the swim leg, that's going to evaporate and cool you down. If you pour water over yourself, that's going to cool you down. And it's kind of like free sweat in a way, or it's sweat. But if you're evaporating off water that you pour over yourself, you actually sweat a little bit less temporarily because you don't need. You've already got that fluid there. You don't need it. The humid environment is a tricky one because, as I said, you don't get as much evaporation and heat loss. So other sort of cooling methods tend to be more effective or more important maybe in those sort of conditions, which might be some of the pre-cooling stuff that some athletes do. So, deliberately using like ice slushies and things like that in the hour or so before an event. Probably more so the shorter endurance events, so things like the marathon, half marathon, that kind of thing. Using cold fluids during a race, although that's not always easy or practical to actually get access to during an event. But if you can, that can be helpful as well. And then some of the other cooling strategies that are sort of beyond nutrition that you see in various, that Australian Tennis Open's a good example here in the summer with the ice towels that they put around their necks and things like that, or ice vests is obviously more pre-exercise. Those kind of things can be effective. I know in cycling, for example, here in Australia, we have our national championships right in the middle of summer, and it can be really hot. And then we have the Tour Down Under here for the pro circuit also, when it can be really hot. And so they'll often get stockings filled with ice cubes and stick them around their neck. So that cools them, but also as that ice melts, it's then putting water over the skin surface to help from that evaporation point of view. So things like that can be helpful, but in humid conditions, it's really challenging. And generally speaking, that's why you see slower times, because people have to back off to not produce as much body heat.
Yeah, interesting. And so in a human condition, even with the increased fluid losses, potentially not necessarily helping with the evaporative cooling effect, does that mean one should increase their fluid intake in a more humid environment because they're losing more, even though it's not necessarily helping them stay cool? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly right. Because if you're losing it from the body, you're losing it from the body from a hydration perspective. So certainly if you're having those higher fluid losses, then, to stay optimally hydrated, you're going to have to drink more, regardless of whether it's helping cool you or not.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I definitely want to dive into sodium because that's obviously your specialty. But before we dive into sodium, I wanted to just touch on ways to test whether it's for sodium and or fluid loss or sweat loss, and what your thoughts are on that. We mentioned obviously that there can be a range of fluid loss, and I would imagine there's also, you're going to tell us there's going to be a range for sodium concentration within the sweat as well. How should people test for that, or what type of athlete should or shouldn't, and how does one test for that?
So if we start off with the fluid side of things, kind of while we're on that topic, and it's probably a good place to start before you get into the sodium anyway, because I mean, we'll get into it shortly, but it probably determines whether you even need to worry about the sodium testing side of it. So from the fluid point of view, I guess most people will probably be familiar with, weighing yourself before and after a training session or a race to get an idea of the body weight loss as a proxy for sweat loss. So the assumption is, certainly for exercise less than about sort of 3 or 4 hours, that the vast majority, if not all of that weight lost, is going to be fluid loss. Now, obviously, if you go to the bathroom somewhere along the way, you'll lose a bit of extra weight that's not from sweating. If you eat things, solid foods, you're gaining weight that's not fluid being gained as well. So you need to account for all of those things sort of when you do those calculations. And even if you drink fluid, if you want to calculate the sweat rate rather than the balance of intake and output, you need to account for that as well. So yeah, so they're the things that I'd be looking at. Obviously, as we said earlier, particularly in those sort of endurance and ultra endurance events, the weather can change dramatically from the start to the middle to the end of a race. And so just having one measurement of sweat rate is kind of useless, because you might know that your sweat rate is 400 mils an hour at this point in the race, but it could be double that later on and half of that even later at nighttime. So you really need to do that kind of testing across all of those different conditions that you expect to encounter on race day. Otherwise you really don't know, and just having that single figure is probably doing yourself a disservice. The other thing that I'd probably add to that, and one thing I've started doing a lot with my athletes recently, is it's one thing to get an idea of what someone's sweat rate is, but it's and potentially how much they drink. Obviously, if you can weigh their water bottles before and after as well. But it's another thing to understand, I guess, what's driving that fluid behavior, and maybe what are the challenges or the barriers to improving it as well. And so what I've started doing now is, just as well as weighing the person before and after, and weighing their bottles and their solid foods before and after, is actually to get a measure of their thirst, like their perceived thirst at the end of the session, and maybe at the start as well, and also their perception of gut tolerance to fluid at the end of the session. In other words, like if you ask them simply, could you drink? So in other words, if I gave you a bottle and said, you have to drink that now, would it be super easy or super difficult to drink in terms of gut tolerance? So those things are really useful. The other thing that's useful is to know how much fluid did you actually have available to you at the start of the session, and what percentage of that did you actually drink? So once you add those extra bits of information to your sweat rate data, you can build a much better picture of not only how much am I losing and how much I'm replacing, but what are the factors that are driving either not replacing enough or possibly even too much in some cases. So you do all of that, and if you decide at the end, I'm not drinking enough, then you can look back and go, well, is that because my thirst isn't actually driving me to drink more? So maybe I do need to drink a little bit ahead of thirst because that's just not working for me. Or is it that I am thirsty, but I can't tolerate the fluid, so I need to go away and do some gut training, actually practice drinking that volume to get my gastrointestinal tract used to it? Or could I have easily drunk more and tolerated it? I just didn't have the fluid available to me, and it's actually a planning issue. I need to organize more fluid to be available. And the same thing can happen for the over drinking. In some cases it might be that, I felt thirsty and I drank, but it was actually too much. So actually maybe I need to limit the amount of fluid that's available to me to stop me over drinking. And so it can work both ways. But yeah, adding that extra information when you do that assessment, I think just opens up all of a sudden all this extra data that you can use to make really good decisions with.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point there too. I mean, talking about the literature that you've seen over the years too, is there was the drink to thirst and then have a drinking plan, and and so I think, like you're saying, maybe there's an individual component there. I mean, did they not have a thirst drive, but maybe potentially needed more, or would they have overconsumed? So I think that's a really helpful piece of information there. I think talking about that too, testing. We've heard kind of like the try not to exceed 3% dehydration or 2% dehydration, and performance will be affected. What are your thoughts on that percentage goal?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So one thing I was just going to finish up with that fluid balance assessment, I think is really important as well, is we talked about, acclimatization or heat acclimation before, increasing the amount that you can potentially sweat if you need to. And that's a really important point is if, for example, here we're in the Southern Hemisphere. So we have a whole bunch of triathletes training throughout the winter when it's very cold. And then they go over in October to Kona to do World Championships. And they've come from a very cold environment to a very hot environment. So if they do all that sort of sweat rate testing here when it's really cold, it might be completely different if they travel to Kona a couple of weeks before the race. And so all of a sudden, all that data is kind of meaningless. So you really need to do that data in the same level of sort of acclimation or acclimatization that you intend to race with as well.
Yeah.
But coming back to that 2%, 3%, whatever it is, it's an interesting question, and I think one that we still don't have a great answer to. Part of the reason for that is that historically a lot of the data that we have around hydration research is not blinded. In other words, and fair enough, it's very hard to blind how much fluid you drink. How do you trick people into knowing I drank lots of fluid, or I drank almost no fluid, or literally no fluid? And so most of the studies that we have are where people replaced almost all of their fluid loss or drank literally nothing. And so it's very easy if you're an athlete to know if you drank lots of fluid or nothing. And there could well be a sort of a placebo effect from that. Just knowing in the back of your mind, I've got no fluid here. You might hold back a little bit when it comes to the performance trial. Thankfully, we do have, I think, 3 studies now where they've actually inserted nasogastric tubes like you'd use in a hospital to actually put the fluid in, so people don't know how much fluid they're getting in.
Fascinating.
So there's been 3 studies like that now, and actually one that did that blinded and unblinded to see whether there was an effect of the blinding, and that one found that actually in that case there wasn't. And so maybe the blinding's not as big a deal as we assume. But all of those studies are in cycling as well. So how much that translates across to running, for example, it may not. We don't really know. But in terms of where that figure lies, my suspicion is, and talking to sort of some of the researchers in this area, is that that figure might be different in different people, or different in different types of events as well. So most of those studies are done with maybe like a 2-hour steady state where you ride at 60% of your VO2 max, or 75% of your max heart rate or something like that for 2 hours to become dehydrated or not, depending on which trial you're doing. And then you do some sort of time trial at the end, complete a certain distance as fast as you can, or something like that. And they're usually fairly high intensity things. Like the actual time trial part is only kind of like a 30-minute all-out effort. And that doesn't really reflect what happens. I mean, that reflects maybe professional cycling, but it doesn't reflect what happens in a marathon or an Ironman or an ultra, where it's not a 30-minute all-out effort. It's a 2-hour plus, or sometimes a 20-hour measured effort. And so the effect of hydration on that, where the intensity is lower, may be completely different, and we just don't know. So it's really hard to know for sure. But certainly speaking to Lewis James, who's done some of that blinded, unblinded research, his thoughts are, looking at the individual participants in those studies is, it might be 2% for this person, but it might be 4% for this person and 1% for this person. So the actual number may be different in different people, and we just don't know and don't currently have a way of studying that very well.
Yeah. So fascinating. I had a client where we did some sweat testing, and I will say he was the biggest sweat loss client I've ever had, where I'm not going to know how to convert this to milliliters. So maybe Nia, you can help me, but it was 135 ounces per hour he was losing in trail running. And he was planning on doing ultra, like 24-hour races. And of course, as you mentioned, his sweat losses are going to change through the different temperatures over that 24-hour race. But with a situation like that, it kind of makes me think too of the question in regards to like how much fluid can someone's gut tolerate. And I know for a very long time, when it comes to carbohydrates, it was like, you can't consume more than 60 grams of carbs. And now it's like, wait a minute, 90, and wait a minute, 120 plus. And so I'd be curious, what are your thoughts with regards to like fluid consumption? Is there a cap? Because I had heard that at one point from some pieces of literature, but I would imagine, is there a gut training response where we can push and exceed that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the literature suggests that that cap is at around sort of 1.2 liters an hour, somewhere around there. Can you go above that? There is one gut training study specifically looking at fluid volume. So, deliberately, incrementally increasing the fluid volume over a period of time, and you get better at tolerating that. Interestingly, in that study, they didn't actually show any better gastric emptying. So you weren't actually emptying that fluid from your stomach any faster, but the stomach was able to just expand and accommodate that fluid just sitting in there and releasing it at the same rate.
Okay.
But I guess if you think about the way that people generally drink during exercise, that's probably still an advantage because, it's not like you can constantly drink throughout exercise, even if you wanted to. You don't have the access to the fluid, or if you're on a bike, you've got handlebars to worry about, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so even just having that fluid sitting there and slowly releasing between now and the next aid station, or the next time you can access your fluid, is probably still advantageous.
Yeah.
So, how high can you push that? I don't think we really know. No one's really studied it. Anecdotally, I've heard of a few athletes that have been able to get well over 1.5 liters an hour, but I would say that's the exception, not the rule.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But similarly, as you said, like with carbohydrate, no one was really trying to push 90 or 100 grams an hour 15 years ago, and now it's not routine, but a lot of athletes can do that because they've put in the work to get there. And it may be the same with fluid, that if people did put in the work, they could get there. But the other thing I would say around that is, even if it was beneficial and even if you could train the gut to do that, it still has to be in a scenario where you can actually practically access that fluid as well. And so that can become a barrier in some events. If you can imagine, Eliud Kipchoge running his 2-hour marathon, he would probably benefit from drinking more fluid than he currently does. But the time he's going to lose in accessing that fluid and trying to drink it while running at 20 kilometers an hour, or a bit over 20 kilometers an hour, without choking on it, he's probably not going to get that in just from a practical perspective rather than a gut tolerance perspective.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I think I heard Asker say something like, when they weighed him pre and post, he lost like 10% of his body weight or something like that.
Oh, no, that was Haile Gebrselassie.
Oh, okay.
So that was, back in, I think, 2008 or 2009 when he broke the world record at Berlin.
Yes.
And Asker had worked with him at that stage.
That would make sense.
And he lost a huge amount. So I don't know if Kipchoge's been measured in that same context, but I don't think it would be as great.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Okay, let's dive into sodium. Can you give us a little breakdown of like possible ranges you've seen in terms of loss? And then again, should someone test their sodium concentration? If so, how would they do that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to point out with the sodium loss side of things is, how do you measure it and how do you interpret that? So generally speaking, the way that we've traditionally done it is we put on some disposable patches on the skin and they absorb sweat, and then you can extract that sweat with various lab techniques, and there's versions of that you can do on the side of a football pitch or a running track or something like that as well. And so that's kind of historically how it's been done, and you can put patches on all sorts of different parts of the body, any sort of available skin surface, but there are sort of more commonly used areas. I guess the second thing, though, is that our sweat sodium concentration varies across different parts of the body. So if you stick a patch on your arm, it doesn't necessarily reflect what's going on your forehead or your chest or your leg or something like that. But one of the really important things is, even if you do go out and get this kind of test and you get a result back, a certain number of millimoles per liter or milligrams per liter, say at the arm, it doesn't necessarily tell you what the concentration is across the entire body. And so you actually have to use, there's been a lot of work gone into this, equations to try and estimate the whole body sweat sodium concentration based on the results of some of the standard patch sites that people tend to use. That may change in the years to come with sort of wearable technology. And it's, I know of several companies that are either have a product on the market or are working on that at the moment to try and, do this and automate, I guess, a lot of those lab processes and the fiddling around with taking patches on and off and extracting the sweat from them. So I think that's going to improve over time and become more accessible to people than it is at the moment. But regardless, they still have to solve that question of, well, I've got this sensor on this one part of my body, what does that mean for the entire body? So Yeah, assuming that they can do that though, then you've got a sweat sodium concentration. So how much sodium in millimoles or milligrams per liter of fluid that you've lost is generally how you would do it. So I guess that's the first thing, is to be able to collect the sweat and analyze it and get a number and have one that actually represents what's going on across the body. The second thing is what to do with that once you've got that number. And that's really where there's been absolutely nothing in the literature to date.
Right.
You know, people like the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, for example, and others have put an enormous amount of time, money, and effort into perfecting the actual sweat collection, extraction, analysis process. And, you know, I think we've all benefited, let's be fair, from that. But what they haven't really spent any time doing is, okay, well, now I've got this result. What does it mean? And what do I do with it? And that's where I've started to try and fill in some of those gaps, you know, since I finished my PhD and done some of this modeling data around that. So, yeah, that's probably the next step is, you know, what do you do with that data? And I think traditionally people have sort of looked at the sodium loss. So you look at the concentration, how many milligrams per liter of sweat, you look at how many liters of sweat you lost, then look at, you know, the total milligrams of sodium that you lose per hour, for example. And then you get a result and people go, oh, that's really high. I need to have lots of sodium. But how much sodium do you need, and why do you need that sodium? More importantly, what are you trying to achieve by replacing that sodium? And so that's, I guess, where that work that I've been doing kind of comes in to try and fill that gap.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'm very curious. And again, maybe you haven't done or seen any research either on this area, but with regards to that, I mean, you find out potentially your sodium concentration per liter or maybe per ounce, like you're saying, and you do that multiplier of, say, the person determines that they're losing 1,000 milligrams of sodium in 60 minutes. Do we know? It sounds like the answer might be no, but like, is it something like fluid losses, like where we should aim to finish the event with 3% loss or 2%? Like, do we know or have any thoughts in that area yet, or theories?
Yeah, well, until this year, not really. Yeah, I guess that's, as I said, what I've been trying to answer at the moment. Just coming back sort of to answer the last bit of your question, what is the normal range of sweat sodium concentration? For a whole body estimate, it's the lower end is about 20 millimoles per liter, which is about 460 milligrams per liter.
Okay.
And the upper end is about 80 millimoles per liter, which is about 1,840 milligrams per liter. Now, some people might go, well, I did a sweat test and it was 110 millimoles per liter. Well, it might have been at that site where you had the patch, but once you estimate that out to a whole body value, you're generally going to be well under 80 millimoles per liter. I think the highest I've ever seen is about 72 or 73. And that sort of fits with the literature around the sort of those big data sets and the normative values, as well as the upper end is about 70 to 75 somewhere, and the lower end is about 18 to 20.
Okay.
But most people sit in the range of probably 30 to 45 is probably pretty normal. 35 seems to be about the average across lots of different people, different conditions, different sports, that kind of thing. Yeah, so in terms of where to go with that, I guess the question you have to ask is, well, what's the purpose of replacing the sodium? What are we trying to achieve? And that'll tell us a little bit about, you know, maybe how we should go about thinking about the replacement side of things. So, you know, if you look at the arguments that people have put forward historically for why you replace sodium during exercise, some of them are related to, you know, what's going on in the blood and you know, offsetting sweat losses, and some of them have got absolutely nothing to do with that. So, for example, people have talked about, oh, well, if you add sodium to your drinks, you absorb the fluid better or faster or more completely or something like that. Actually, the literature says it makes very little, if any, difference. But again, like, it's got nothing to do with your sweat losses. It's just about how much sodium you put in the drink as a concentration. It's it's unrelated to your sweat losses, so you don't need a sweat sodium test to tell you that. The other one that some people will talk about is, you know, just the flavor. Like, I put more sodium in my drinks because it tastes better and it makes me want to drink more, and I get better, you know, I maintain my hydration better when I do that.
Right.
And again, that's got absolutely nothing to do with you. You don't need a sweat test to tell you what tastes good or not. You just add as much or as little sodium as you prefer from a taste perspective. So again, you don't need fancy sweat sodium testing to tell you that either. So I guess where it comes into, you know, what's going on in the body, in the blood and the various fluid compartments of the body, is thinking about the concentration of sodium within there. And the other thing that people tend to think about is, well, how much sodium have I got in the body? And if I lose too much of that, a thing's going to go wrong.
Right.
And these two can kind of seem a bit contradictory at times, because when we exercise, if we go out and do a big training session for 2 or 3 hours, hot weather, we're sweating a lot, we're losing a lot of sodium, but we drink nothing, literally nothing, take no sodium, our blood sodium concentration is going up. And it's going up because while we're losing all this water and we're losing some sodium, our body actually retains at least sort of usually 50% or more of the sodium that was going to be lost through the sweat gland is captured back into the body before it actually leaves. And so, yes, we're losing water. Yes, we're losing sodium, but we're losing proportionally more water than sodium. And so the concentration of sodium in the blood and the fluid that surrounds all our cells goes up when we do that. So you've got this situation where the total amount of sodium in your body is going down, but the concentration in the fluids of your body is going up. So then you're like, well, what's going on? You know, which one's more important? Which one do I need to manage as a priority? And so that can be a challenge. So we think about the concentration side of things first, because that'll help us come back and answer the other one. We know if we drink nothing, our blood sodium goes up. If we drink too much during exercise, our blood sodium, and we have no sodium in that drink, the blood sodium goes down, and that's when you end up with hyponatremia that you see in sort of ultra endurance athletes, where the sweat rate is relatively low, access to fluid is relatively high, the ability to tolerate that is better than the higher intensity events, that sort of thing. And so it's easier to overdrink. But I guess the question is, well, when does it stop going up and start going down? And is there a point where that happens where it's actually you would want to drink that much, or maybe even slightly more fluid than that from a hydration point of view? And so that's the work that I've done this year and last year as well, is doing some mathematical modeling to try and work out where that kind of tipping point occurs. And so to do that, you can take an equation that comes from clinical medicine, and then it has been validated during exercise as well. And then the original equation tries to predict your blood sodium concentration at the end of exercise, given what it was at the start, given how much fluid you lose and replace, how much sodium you lose and replace. But like any equation, like it's just algebra, you can use high school maths and rearrange the equation so the bit before the equal sign is the sodium intake rather than the final sodium concentration. And so that's what I did in this research I published earlier this year, is rearrange the equation to say, okay, well, if we want the sodium concentration at the end of exercise to be the same as it was at the start of exercise, given the fluid ins and outs and the sodium losses, how much sodium do we actually need to consume to make that happen? And so once you do that, you can start to say, okay, well, at what point in terms of my fluid replacement do I actually start to need sodium? And it seems to be at around the 70% fluid replacement mark. It varies slightly depending on your sweat sodium concentration. So if you're a very salty sweater, it might happen slightly earlier than that. If you're a very low salty sweater, it might not happen till about 80 to 90%. But for most people kind of in the middle, which represents the majority, it's at about sort of 70%. So once you start drinking enough to replace more than 70% of your fluid losses, that sodium concentration is going to start to fall unless you take some sodium during exercise.
Interesting.
And then you can start to quantify, okay, well, you know, what percentage of my sodium loss do I actually need to replace? And so for the average sweater, maybe a sweat sodium concentration of 40 millimoles per liter. You know, if you replace 80% of your fluid losses, you only need about 29% of your sodium loss to be replaced. It's not until you get to sort of 90% plus fluid replacement that you really need any significant amount, or very salty sweat, so above kind of 60 millimoles per liter, that you need to replace sort of 50% of your sodium loss or more. And in most cases, you probably don't need to replace any sodium because your sodium is still going to go up regardless.
Wow. I think that's very interesting. And I think you gave you said 70% of fluid loss or sodium loss?
Yes.
Okay.
Fluid loss. Yeah.
Okay. And so would that be kind of using that? Well, would that be 3%? now I'm going back. Like 3% body weight loss is not 30% body weight loss. So
yeah, so this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So
yeah,
I guess there's different ways you can think about fluid replacement. There's trying to prevent, say, a 2% or a 3% body mass loss. You can draw that cutoff wherever you like, but the concept is the same. That's obviously, it's a percentage of body mass, but it's kind of an absolute amount in that 2% body mass loss, whatever that number works out to be, is going to be the same no matter whether I'm doing 1 hour of exercise or 20 hours of exercise. 2% of body mass is still 2% of the body mass at the start. But obviously the total fluid that you're losing over 20 hours is going to be a lot greater than it was over 1 or 2 hours.
Right.
So if we think, and I think this is where in the past, historically, from a research point of view, it's maybe led people astray a little bit, or just maybe we're not thinking about it right. So just to give you an example, let's say you were aiming for a 2 kilogram body mass loss. Work out what the percentage is, but say that was the number that you were aiming for. Now you could go out and run a half marathon and have a sweat rate of 2 liters an hour and finish the race in an hour because you're quick. You've lost 2 kilos of body mass, even if you didn't drink anything. So you've literally replaced 0% of your fluid losses and finished at that 2 kilo deficit. Now that same person could go out and run an ultra marathon for 20 hours and they could lose 20 liters of fluid, but to end up at a 2 kilo deficit, they have to replace 18 liters out of that 20 lost. So all of a sudden, they need to replace 90% of their fluid losses to end up with the same fluid deficit at the end of the 20-hour race that they did at the end of the 1 hour race. So same fluid deficit, but very different percentage fluid replacement because the overall fluid loss is different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Yep. That makes a lot of sense.
And so what I tried to do is say, okay, well, if we're aiming for, say, 2% or 3% body mass loss, whatever it is, how much sweat do you have to lose before you need to replace sort of 70% or more of that fluid loss? And it seems to be the crossover point. It varies a little bit on body weight, but it's probably about 4 to 5 liters total sweat loss. So once you're losing more than that, whether that's a high sweat rate and maybe 2 hours or a slower, lower sweat rate, but maybe 10 hours plus of exercise, either way, if you're losing more than about 4 or 5 liters of fluid during an event or a training session, that's probably when drinking more than 70% is required to stay within that kind of 2% or 3% body mass loss.
That's super interesting. And I think the testing piece obviously is really important there, right? So, I mean, I think many times we'll have athletes come to us and they're doing, a half marathon and they're going to be out there for 3 hours and we measure their sweat losses and they're only losing 17 or 20 ounces an hour. That's nowhere near 4 to 5 liters over that 3-hour window of racing. So potentially the kind of suggestion then would be, would they just rely on carbohydrates as fuel and not necessarily a large emphasis on sodium in that specific situation?
Yeah, exactly right.
Fluids.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of works in a couple of different ways. If you think about, coming back to, as I said before, the kind of the total body sodium deficit, which is generally how people have thought about it historically. And, I want to prevent this big sodium deficit. Obviously, the more you're sweating, the bigger that deficit is going to be. Yeah. If you're a saltier sweater, that'll happen earlier. If you're a less salty sweater, that'll happen later, but it'll still happen eventually just because of the liters of fluid that you've lost.
Right.
And so, having a replacement of sodium based on the fluid replacement, at first you're kind of like, well, I'm losing all this sodium, but I'm only drinking 50% of my fluid back again, like only replacing 50% of my fluid losses. And you're telling me I don't need to replace any sodium. And I'm like, well, yeah, because if you do, your blood sodium is already going to go up because you're not drinking enough. And if you take more and more sodium, you're only going to make that worse. And so in that situation, if you're worried about the big sodium deficit, first you've got to fix the fluid issue. You're probably not drinking enough fluid. And then if you get to that 70% fluid replacement, then you do need the sodium to go with that. And then you are replacing a portion of that sodium deficit and making it not as big as it would have been. So I think sometimes when you hear athletes anecdotally say, oh, well, I lose heaps of sodium and I know when I take sodium, it makes me feel so much better. I suspect it's actually not the sodium that's making them feel better. It's by taking that sodium, they're either getting more thirsty and drinking more. And so it's actually the hydration that's making them feel better, or they're actually planning like that that sodium comes in the fluid, and so they're forcing themselves to drink more to get the sodium in.
Mm.
And so it's actually the fluid or the extra fluid that they're taking on that's making them feel better, more so than not being in a sodium deficit, quote unquote.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's a tricky one, but to get your head around. But ultimately, I think the fluid replacement kind of drives the need for sodium rather than the other way around. And so the sodium replacement is really there to balance the fluid replacement. And so if we go out and try and replace all our sodium losses, but we just drink to thirst and don't drink very much fluid during exercise, we're going to end up hypernatremic and a really high blood sodium and problems associated with that. And so, you need to know what's going on with the fluid before you can really plan what's going on with the sodium.
Right. Yeah. I want to be mindful of your time. And I already can say I would love to do a part 2 with you, because I know we're on time and I still have a ton of questions that I would have loved to dive into with you. Can I ask you one question from our audience, and then we can do your 2 truths and a lie, and let you get to your work, and then maybe we can schedule a part 2 to have you back and go into a bunch of other stuff. But so I've gotten the question from an athlete in the past, racing in Kona. During Kona, towards the end, fingers were swelling, and then the next day, ankles swollen, wrists swollen, hands swollen. Is that something where, if they're noticing swelling during a race, is that likely something where they should increase fluids and decrease sodium, or vice versa? What would your suggestion be in the instance of during racing noticing that going on?
Yeah, so I guess what you're describing there is what we would call edema. So basically, fluid is getting out of the blood and into what we call the interstitial space, which is the space that's not in our bloodstream, but it's not in our cells either. It's kind of in the gaps in between. Now, you can have edema from actual swelling within the cells. That's what happens with hyponatremia, for example. That's much more serious condition, but also much more uncommon. What's more common is just extra fluid sitting around in that interstitial space. Now, the fluid exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid happens at our capillaries. And so as fluid and proteins and minerals and things travel through our blood, when they get to the capillary, the fluid and the electrolytes or the minerals can kind of cross over into the interstitial fluid and back again fairly readily. And there's sort of a gradient that pulls them into the interstitial fluid initially. And it's actually the proteins that sit in our blood which then draw some of that back into the capillaries before it leaves through, to go back to our heart through the veins. And so as the blood first enters the capillary from the sort of the arterial end, it leaves into the interstitial fluid, and as it gets towards the other end to the veins, some of it gets drawn back in. Now, with edema, what's happening is not enough of it's being drawn back in, and that's usually because there's a dilution of concentration-wise of those proteins that are in the blood, which don't readily cross across that barrier, whereas the minerals and the water freely moves across. So, I mean, generally where you see that is because the blood vessels have expanded, particularly in the heat, and we've had more blood flowing to the skin, for example, and to the periphery, the hands and the feet and things like that. So you get more blood flowing there. Those arteries and veins are opening up more, and you get an expansion usually in the plasma volume, so the fluid component of the blood, that's going to dilute those proteins, and so they're not drawing as much of that fluid back in to the blood vessels as it leaves the capillary to go back to the heart again. And so in terms of what that actually means, it's a tricky one. Obviously, if you're significantly overhydrated, that'll be an issue. As your plasma volume expands, it's kind of an inevitability to some extent that that's going to happen. Is it life-threatening? Probably not. Is it annoying? Yes. But is it something that we need to really do a lot about? In most cases, probably not. Yeah, I mean, I think, maintaining good hydration, having an appropriate but not excessive amount of sodium, and yeah, that's pretty much all you can do, and trying to keep your body temperature in check as best as you can.
Yeah, I mean, with that situation, if it is, so was it possible that she was over consuming plain water do you think? Like if it was too dilute or?
It is possible, and you do see that kind of edema in people with hyponatremia that are fluid overloaded. Yes, so that can happen. Yeah.
Interesting. And so, like in the days post race, many times athletes will have, I mean, something like Kona, right? Is that they will have a bit of probably fluid retention or something like that. But is there any tricks or suggestions to maybe speed that up? Should one keep just hitting the fluids really hard, like in the days post race, or should they include electrolytes, or what are your thoughts on that, like post recovery?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the way to get rid of any kind of excess fluid is to pee it out if you're not exercising. And so, any sodium that you add, for example, is going to increase the osmolality in the blood. Is going to want your kidneys are going to want to retain that water. So that's not going to be helpful in that scenario. So I think, just drinking kind of a normal amount of fluids. I don't think you have to overdo it and let the kidneys do their job. And that, it might take a couple of days, but it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
In most cases. Yeah.
I think that's super helpful. So we definitely, like I said, would love to have you back, but we will dive into your 2 truths and a lie. So as we mentioned, we had, let's see, I'm finding those in our notes. So we had 11-year-old mini golfing age group winner. We have the mountain biking, broke your collarbone, and then the 12-hour mountain bike race post training camp, long day essentially. So I said the collarbone, I think, and Nia, you said, did you say the mini golf?
Mini golf.
Yeah. That's right.
All right. So break it down for us, Alan. What was the lie?
Yeah. So no, the mini golf was true. I did cheat my way into the tournament and then won it. The crazy 22-hour round trip or whatever is true as well. So it was the collarbone.
Oh, cool.
So it was the collarbone. I did come off my bike a few weeks before the wedding, but I didn't break my collarbone. I did my AC joint, but I didn't need a sling or anything like that. So
that's good.
I got away with one there.
That's good. I'm glad you didn't have that in your wedding pictures. So
yeah.
Your wife's happy. Awesome. And so where can people find you, Alan? Do you have, are you on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, any of those things, or a website?
Yeah. So a few different places because I sort of wear multiple hats. So I guess the first one is, Monash University. So if you just Google my name and Monash University, you'll probably find the researcher profile, which has all the sort of papers and things like that. Obviously, things like LinkedIn. Again, you can just Google my name and it'll come up. That should be pretty easy to find. In terms of Twitter, the handle is a tricky one. So my private practice is called Next Level Nutrition, and I know there's a US Next Level Nutrition, and I get people confused between the two all the time. But it's NEXT, so Next LVLNUT.
Okay.
So that's the Twitter handle. Instagram, I have that same handle for Instagram, but I don't really use it. But I do have my own podcast and we have an Instagram for that. So the podcast is called The Long Munch. So just The Long Munch as a Instagram handle and on Twitter as well. So yeah, we have a podcast there where we ask sort of common nutrition questions that runners, cyclists and triathletes have. Like our latest one, for example, is like, are sports drinks and gels bad for my teeth? Or we've had ones like, is low carb right for me? Or why do I get gut issues during exercise? Things like that. And then we have an expert, researcher or practitioner in one episode, and then an athlete or a coach in a second, like a follow-up episode for each question to sort of put in their perspective as well. So
I love that. That's awesome. Well, you guys check out Alan's podcast, check him out on the socials. And thank you again, Alan, so much for joining us. We hope to definitely have you back for a part 2 to dive into a whole lot more stuff.
Yeah, no problem. Pleasure.